This is the one we've been watching all those years.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Thank you, everyone. I'm working with the block, Northwestern, and this team of curators has been an utter pleasure. I mean, genuinely, I've fallen in love with the institution, with Northwestern, with this region, with the kind of dedication that has gone, that underpins this project. If you get the weather right, and this is the perfect place. And I just want to thank particularly Lisa, Kathleen, Susanna, Lindsay, and all of the dedicated staff at the block who've put in so much, more than one could reasonably ask. Tireless hours, endless hours of painstaking work that have been so generously lavished on this exhibition. And the manifestation, wow, it's absolutely gorgeous. I couldn't be more delighted to be a part of this. But also wanted to thank the many people, individuals, institutions who have helped us by funding this exhibition. Africa is an extraordinary continent, a landmass of more than 11 million square miles. It's larger than China, Europe, and the United States combined. Home to more than 3,000 distinct ethnic groups who speak more than 2,000 languages, over a quarter of all the languages spoken on our planet. A place so diverse that two Africans could be more genetically unalike than a Chinese and a European. A continent with a longer historical trajectory than any other. Yet this font of culture, this crucible of humankind, sits on the periphery of societal knowledge, barely reflected on in our national curriculum. Indeed, we generally know less about its cultures, about its economies, about its peoples, than anywhere else on earth. And we must put that right. In part, we owe it to our children, to Africa, and because there are many things that suggest that Africa's future will be as remarkable as its past, that there might well be a moment in our medium term when serious engagement with the African continent, one of the fastest growing regions on earth, will become an economic necessity. The continent's population will more than double to 2.3 billion people by 2050. It possesses approximately 30% of the Earth's remaining mineral resources, the largest reserves of precious metals, with over 40% of gold reserves, over 60% of cobalt, 90% of platinum. It produces 8 million barrels of oil every day. A continent of 400 plus companies with revenues of over $1 billion, and with $1.4 trillion in consumer spending, more than India. It is a quiet and increasingly stable powerhouse. I recently attended a TED Global conference, which experts in a variety of different areas, from genetics to engineering, they all gathered together. And these are people who are pushing the very boundaries of human understanding. They're invited to postulate upon the future. And the only thing that all the speakers had in common, beyond their energy and beyond their optimism, was that they were African. They worked in African and they were leaders in their fields. And I came away inspired and concerned. The African continent will be increasingly part of our thinking. And yet we teach our children so little about it. And perhaps more tragically, we seem to care so little. It might be that the future of global economics will force us to care more. But I'd argue that we should simply do so because it's the right thing to do. We owe it as much to ourselves as to the continent to learn more, to listen more, to try to understand more. I don't think it would require a great leap of imagination to envisage a time when Africa might be a great global intellectual hub, driving the economies of its allies and neighbours, catalysing the culture and the intellectual development of many more. Its intellectuals accepted as global thought leaders, its businesses and its communities drivers of the world community. That is far from being a dream. After all, that description of a possible African future is also a perfect description of a corroborable African past, of a time before colonialism, when African cultures drove the intellectual innovation and wealth generation of a significant proportion of the globe. I'm describing a time when Great Zimbabwe dominated the great gold trade routes that fueled the opulent coastal Swahili sultanates, and through them the cultures of the Indian Ocean. It was a time when the emperors of Ethiopia presided over a vast kingdom that boasted the longest continuous tradition of Christianity, with a formidable transcontinental ecumenical influence. But even in that company, it was the kingdoms of the Sahara that might be considered the continental medieval Jew. It's a story that begins long before the medieval period. This is Meroe in Sudan, in the eastern Sahara, where ancient Nubian pyramids sit beached on the desert sand. But carved into their surfaces are images that give a clue to what this region once looked like. Healthy, yoked oxen once ploughed its green fields. About 4,000 years ago, within the span of oral history, the Sahara was lush and green, and it supported a complex ecology, a variety of nomadic peoples, a diversity of wildlife, of forests, of rivers, but with climate change came new ways of life. It's no coincidence that a disproportionate number of the greatest empires that the world has ever seen were formed in this hostile environment. We know about Nubia, we know about Egypt, about Carthage in the classical era, but the Berber, the Almohads, the Almoravids, the kingdoms of Ghana, of Songhai, and many other great cultures that rose up and thrived on the western edges of the Sahara in the medieval period are far less well known. They formed a nexus of cultures that have left us some of the most astounding cultural artifacts the world has ever seen. And this exhibition tells that remarkable story. As the desert grew and those of nomadic communities found their traditional ways of life tested, dazzling new cultures began to evolve, concentrating hard-won skills and new knowledge together for the very first time. And it resulted in one of the most aggressive periods of progress in history. From disparate communities of hunter-gatherers grew sophisticated economies, not unlike our own today. These were cultures that learned to collaborate with the changing environment, working with the benefits of the desert, each in turn thriving until they were either toppled by a rival or overcome by the inexorable onslaught of the desert. One of the greatest emerged in the Western Sahara, in what is today Mali. It has left us a stunning but fragile legacy. Even if we don't know this chapter of history, this is a culture that we probably know something of. After all, this is one of the most famous images of a medieval personality. And it's a story as fascinating as it is important. And the legacies of what it represents continue to reverberate across Africa. At the beginning of 2013, many of us watched in utter horror as dozens of Mali's most ancient monuments were deliberately damaged or destroyed. It was an example of how these histories are not lost or dormant, of how they continue to crackle with a kind of relevance. In a campaign of systematic vandalism, Ansarudine and Al-Qaeda affiliated militia pushed further and further south from their desert strongholds into regions of increasing historical importance, destroying tombs, burning manuscripts, and damaging buildings. They eventually converged on the city of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a World Heritage Site. If you get the chance, visit. Genuinely, it's a place that is transformative. Known as the city of 333 saints, it's the home of 16 shrines of Islamic Sufis, and it's an obvious high-value target for a group like this. The fighting was brief but devastating, destroying parts of the city's world-famous mosque, one of the ancient madrasas that make up the University of Timbuktu. I mean, this is a collection of buildings, mostly built out of straw, and it's a particular kind of building technique that is buildings made from straw, from wood, from limestone reinforcements, and created into a wonderful form of adobe. It's utterly unique. But it was a technique that begins centuries before. In the first half of the 13th century, the Mali Empire was wrestled from the shifting trade routes and societal chaos that were the fading embers of one of the great West African empires, the Ghana Empire. For almost 1,000 years, the Ghana Empire had ruled over a vast region of what is today southeast Mauritania and western Mali. The eventual routing of the Ghana Empire by their Berber neighbours presented an opportunity to build a new kind of state. Its founder, Sunjata Keita, was a formidable military strategist and a visionary who, like so many African leaders in this golden moment of African flowering, understood the importance of securing his history. He wanted to be remembered as a man who consolidated the southern states of the once mighty Ghana Empire into a coherent and ambitious new empire. And we don't know that much about him as a man. The Mali Empire's founder, his early life it's shrouded in ambiguity and multiple oral histories which contradict and overlap. But we can guess, approximate, that he was born around 1235, so he grew up in this period of profound flux. He would have grown up amongst the chaos of Ghana's demise, but perhaps he would have learned about some of those more ancient cultures that I talked about earlier, that had left their mark on the landscape when the Sahara region was fertile. He would have seen the transition in the north, or been aware of it, of the great Berber dynasties. He may have heard about the rise of the Ife to the south, and perhaps even of the dominance of the Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia to the east. It was a moment, and he must have sensed it, of African renaissance, a moment of burgeoning and quickening change, of growing confidence across the continent, as a new, outwardly focused set of regimes began to build ambitious states as far afield as Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili Sultanates. And what was distinctive about each one of them, and also strangely similar, was that they had direct contact with cultures beyond the continent, each driven to also invest in securing their own discrete cultural and intellectual legacy. Sunjata Keita, he was ambitious too. He knew in this environment that he couldn't stand still, and he wanted to build a modern kind of state, a state that would last. And I imagine that this came out of his earliest years. One of his earliest memories would have been when his home in Cambaga, was attacked by the army of one of the most kind of formidable and ruthless kings of that period, Sunguru Kanta. And at the beginning of the 13th century, this king decides that he is going to impose a new kind of rule. And he wipes out many of his neighbours. And Sunjata and many of his brothers and his sister, they were killed. One of his sisters carried away to actually marry the king, leaving Sunjata as the sole heir to the throne. And it's like one of those great legends in which this boy left, bereft, without his family. He knew that destiny called. Like their Berber and Ethiopian contemporaries, the founders of Mali developed this into an epic saga of origin for impregnably bound people of their new empire. This story of this young boy who, against all odds, stood up against the forces of the invaders. They made it, this history, into something which was as beautiful as the cave paintings of their antecedents. They'd learned from the Muslim scholars who had visited the Ghana court. They utilised the griots and the skilled orators and the musicians, and they wove a new kind of history, a history which institutionalised the very form of passing on narrative. And they did it using music, like the music that we heard today. A kind of new historical force that would gather people together, both to inform them and to give pleasure, to reinforce the sense of state through something which was incredibly beautiful. It seemed to be part of a global moment that reached beyond Africa. Just at that time, around the globe, think of the things that were happening. Pope Innocent III, he was beginning to build new histories in Rome. The ruthless Genghis Khan, simultaneously, he was making his mark, but also doing it through thinking about his story. Stunning material heritage was critical to these empires. For much of the next century, the Mali Empire passed down through direct descendants of Sunjata. And the very last, Abu Bakr, named after the father-in-law of Muhammad, ascended the throne at the beginning of the 14th century. And Abu Bakr Keita, known as the Voyager King, he was as ambitious as his forefathers. But if you think about his kingdom, it was bounded on one side by the Sahara and on the other by the Atlantic, leaving him with scant options for expansion. He looked north at his great Berber neighbours, aware of how they vanquished Ghana, and he recognised the pressure to either expand or to be threatened. Now, Mansa Musa, who we heard about earlier, he served at Abu Bakr's court. He served as his counsellor and as his heir apparent. And he forensically charted the emperor's desire, this kind of obsession that he built with empire expansion. And he witnessed how that fixation ultimately led to his downfall. Abu Bakr decided that rather than the desert, rather than the mountains, he would take on the Atlantic. The first attempt to sail across the Atlantic ended in utter failure. Hundreds of ships left the coast, and only a single boat returned. They were told that they couldn't turn back unless they ran out of food. And so when this single boat returned, the king, of course, he was initially distraught. But he didn't give up. He was utterly undeterred. And this time, he wouldn't leave it to one of his lieutenants. He would lead this expedition himself. In 1312, he tried again, this time at the helm of one of 1,000 fully laden ships. Neither the emperor nor his ships were ever seen again. And Mansa Musa, later that year, ascended the throne. Now Mansa Musa, he'd seen these changes, and it had given him a kind of wisdom that was unlike his predecessors. He had all the power of Sanjata, all of the money, all of the territory of his predecessors. But he wanted to find his own frontiers to traverse, not the Atlantic. He wanted to define a new paradigm by which he could measure success. He didn't just want to be a better emperor. He didn't just want wealth and power. He wanted to be like the great Berber dynasties. He saw something that they saw as being part of his new Mali empire. He sought knowledge. And he pursued it with a focus, with a dedication of a general waging a major campaign. And the final pillars of the final of the 5 pillars of Islam is that one must undertake a pilgrimage or a hajj. And if you have the resources of someone like Mansa Musa, that you do it in real style. But he knew that this wasn't a trip that could be undertaken lightly. Well, a number of his predecessors had tried, and at least one had lost their life whilst doing so. But Mansa Musa, as we'd heard, he was an excellent rider. He had impressive stables of Arab horses. And whilst his predecessors might have taken on the 2,000-mile crossing across the Atlantic, the actual journey across the desert was probably as difficult, was at least 3 times further, and across some of the most unforgiving terrain on earth. So in 1324, 12 years or so after becoming emperor, it's said that 60,000 people left the Mali Empire with Mansa Musa. Most would walk every hard mile to Mecca. It's said that there were 8,000 soldiers, 12,000 of his personal retinue, some members of his court, but mostly just ordinary citizens who saw in this man something important, who saw in him a new kind of future for their state. And along with them travelled 80 camels, each bearing perhaps as much as 300 pounds of gold. I'm vague about these things because there are so many different accounts. Each night when they stopped, it said that it would be like a whole town decamping in the desert. They took with them everything they needed, including a mobile mosque that they would construct so that the emperor could pray. The logistical complexity of shepherding so many people across an arid landscape would have been every bit as tough as waging a military campaign or navigating a fleet across the Atlantic. No one ever engaged in taking on the Hajj with such style. And his arrival in Cairo in July 1324 was greeted, as you can understand, with huge celebration. The Egyptian historian Al-Makrizi described Mansa Musa's arrival. He's a young man with brown skin, a pleasant face, a good figure, instructed in Malachite law. He appeared amidst his companions magnificently dressed and mounted and surrounded by more than 10,000 subjects. He brought gifts and presents that amazed the eye, and with their beauty and splendour. And the Mamluk Sultan, Al-Nazir Muhammad, perhaps recognising Mansa Musa as the richest man as has been said, who ever lived, ordered his city to give the emperor the welcome that he deserved. Yet even Mansa Musa was, according to Egyptian etiquette, meant to bow before his host, the Sultan. But rather than show his subservience, as was customary, he kissed the ground in praise of Allah. And he was welcomed to the court. Mansa Musa, he was a natural diplomat. He knew that he must accept local mores, but Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, he wasn't about to bow to anyone. The Sultan was utterly won over, and he invited Mansa Musa to shelter in Cairo over the summer, perhaps knowing that this hugely wealthy man might bring benefit to the city's economy with his generosity. And, as we heard earlier, it's much repeated that he gave away so much gold that it had repercussions for the next decade. And when cooler weather arrived, Mansa Musa and his caravan pushed on to Mecca. And after completing his pilgrimage, he stayed to meet some of the great Islamic scholars. And over the period of Hajj, areas of Mecca, this is the thing to imagine, areas of Mecca, they attracted some of the finest thinkers of the age. These were the superstars. And they would gather together to spend time in each other's company. They'd exchange gossip, but mainly this was a way of exchanging the latest ideas. And one can imagine that he may well have met scholars who had travelled from the newly established university in Salamanca, or from the ancient Berber centres of intellectual excellence, or perhaps even the scholars who'd followed him on that last leg from Cairo. Some would have doubtless hailed from the courts of Venice or the madrasas of the burgeoning Ottoman Empire. And we know that Mansa Musa was utterly entranced. And as he made arrangements to return, he invited a number of these intellectuals to return with him. Amongst them, there were some who claimed to be descendants of the Prophet himself. And they returned to his old capital at Diana. Amongst them was one of the great poets and architects of the age, Abu al-Sahili. And he'd learned his trade under the formidable Berber architects in Granada. And as much as being a pilgrimage, it was also a statement to the world about his wealth, about his ambition, and about the intellectual culture of Mali. And the news of this journey, it created waves. Waves that reverberated beyond the Middle East and Europe. I mean, 50 years later, this image by Cresques, the cartographer, would immortalize the emperor, holding a gold nugget at the centre of this Catalan atlas made for Charles V. It's an image of a particular kind of African wisdom and wealth that would become a point of inspiration for European artists for centuries to come. But Mansa Musa wasn't finished. It wasn't just going to be about the Hajj, about his own personal religious redemption. He wanted to make a mark that would change his state. When he got home, he engaged his architect, Abu al-Sahili, to construct a spectacular palace, a new great mosque, for his new Timbuktu. And according to the Berber historian Ibn Khaldun, the builder was paid the equivalent of more than $2 million. The complex of buildings was constructed in the same materials that are still utilised by locals today. Wet earth mixed with straw, moulded and fashioned into these beautiful shapes. These are well-insulated buildings that can withstand the forces of ferocious desert winds and occasional rains. And when it was complete, the mosque comprised of inner courtyards, prayer spaces for the congregations as big as 2,000 people. It was was and remains an architectural masterpiece, one of the most iconic buildings in Africa. And over the next decade, the Sankore and the great mosques and the buildings around and between them developed to become one of the most comprehensive and important archives since the Library of Alexandria. And at its peak, Timbuktu could accommodate 25,000 students, and housed at least 400,000, perhaps as many as 800,000 manuscripts. The city was a match for the most respected universities in Europe. And around these madrasas grew up an ecology of private libraries, publishers, booksellers, and many of whom would become hugely wealthy, not trading in gold, trading in knowledge. And in some ways, Sankore was not like a European university. It had no central senate, but was made up of independent madrasas and libraries, each led by their own imam or scholar. But there are also ways in which it did resemble a university in the West. Students met in courtyards, in rooms and corridors of mosques and houses to formally learn about subjects like Arabic, law, history, astronomy, chemistry, philosophy, medicine, and a range of practical trades. And at the heart of the curriculum, developed by the most respected intellectual luminaries, was Quranic, Islamic, and Arabic studies. If one was to transpose Latin for Arabic, substitute the Quran for the Bible, we might well be describing a medieval European university. Like its emperor, the city was driven by the pursuit of innovative and rigorous thinking. Even whilst acknowledging the underpinning place of formal religion, the Mali Empire was a culturally liberal state that accommodated the finest academic ideas and invention wherever they came from. It would be within this city's confines that some of the most radical medieval thinking would happen. Invention in areas as varied as mathematics and human rights. Its highest academic degree could take a decade to complete. And as its prestige and reputation grew, it drew students and academics from across the West and across North Africa, and from the great madrasas of Mecca and indeed from Southern Europe. And whilst it might have been established on Mali's eastern border, looking outward across the desert, it quickly became a confident, intellectually distinctive centre that had its own gravitational pull. And I think that is what this image so vividly captures. And today, as strident fundamentalist intellectual forces like Ansardine and Boko Haram continue to be popular in West Africa, it's that liberal spirit of dynamic intellectual defiance that holds these ancient traditions in good stead. When the medieval king Mansa Musa made Timbuktu his capital, he looked upon his new city as the Medici saw Florence, as a centre of an open, intellectual, entrepreneurial empire that thrived on great ideas wherever they came from. The city, the culture, the very intellectual DNA of this region are so beautifully complex and diverse that it will always remain in part located in storytelling traditions that derive from indigenous pre-Islamic cultural traditions. This highly successful form of Islam that developed here in Mali became popular because it accepted those freedoms and that inherent cultural diversity. And the celebration of that complexity, that love of rigorously contested discourse, that appreciation of narrative, the glorious art and material culture which it inspired, was and remains And it's that spirit that linked these great West African cultures. And it's that